Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, November 29th, 2007. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week, Bob Taylor, a home brewer in Anchorage, Alaska, walks us through the process of making sake, or as I used to say, sake. Bob has put together a website describing his process, and he hits the high points with us in this episode. Well, if you're new to home brewing or would like to get into the hobby for the first time, check out our website, basicbrewing.com, where you can find archives of our audio and video podcasts and our DVDs to walk you through basic and more advanced brewing techniques. Well, I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving, or at least those of you in this country who do Thanksgiving. My family and I headed to Hot Springs National Park, Arkansas, and ate like there was no tomorrow. So, I've been spending a lot of time on the exercise machine since I got back, and, because you got to get ready for round 2. It happens in about a month. I've also been busy packing boxes full of DVDs and logbooks. I appreciate everybody who's been ordering our new low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD and our 2008 Brewer's Logbook. It's especially gratifying to see the names of returning customers who've ordered from us before, and I guess that means we're doing something right. We appreciate everybody helping to support this podcast. I didn't get into the mailbag last time because of the holiday, so let's jump in there today. First off, I want to thank those of you who have continued to send in your brewing nightmare stories. We've gotten some good ones, and I'd like to keep them coming. I figure close to Christmas, I hope Steve, Andy, and I will be able to get together and record a show sharing those stories and also sharing some of our own, too. On a different note, I want to thank those of you who in the Netherlands who emailed in to help Brad find home brewing resources over there. It sounds like there's a lot of good brewing going on over there, and I hope Brad can get connected. And again, I appreciate everybody's help there. Stephen writes in, and Stephen didn't let us know where he is. Stephen writes in with a question this week. James, looking for any comments you or your listeners might have on the risk of, if any, of boiling the wort on day 2. I've set up my batch sparge system, and like others have a limited time with a young family. My solution was to process the mash on day 1, and Stephen says anything that grows in that short time will not survive the boil. At least that's my theory. Holding unboiled wort overnight isn't something that I've ever done myself, but there are a couple of thoughts that I have about it. I have heard of brewers letting their wort cool after the boil overnight, but this is a different situation. After boiling, the wort is sterile, and you just have to make sure that you don't let any new bugs into the kettle while you sleep. But what you're talking about is unboiled wort straight out of the mash tun. And in this case, I think you have to assume that there are things in there that can spoil your wort. And while you will kill the actual bugs themselves in the boil, they may have already left off flavors behind before they sort of meet their maker in the boil by the time the wort sits overnight. So if you think of the process of sour mashing, that's similar thinking there. Also, here's another thought. If you don't do a mash out to denature the enzymes in the wort, you may wind up with a wort that's more fermentable than you want because the enzymes will keep working in the wort there. So, I don't know. What do you think? Anybody out there who does this on a regular basis or who has done it in the past, let us know. If you mash one day, save the wort, and then boil the next, how's that work for you? And shoot me a note and let me know. I'd be curious to know. Brian from Columbia, Maryland, wrote to brag on one of our past guests. Brian says, just listened to your interview with Garrett from Maui Brewing Company. I had the right to tell you that my wife and I visited Maui Brewing Company while on vacation in September. We are vegetarians, and there wasn't a lot on the menu to fit our needs. Garrett came over and talked with us for a few minutes. He asked what we wanted to eat and said that the chefs would make it for us. The food was excellent, and the beer was fantastic. But the thing we remember most was how friendly and helpful Garrett was. It was nice to hear him talk about his belief in a more personal business style on the podcast, and we can testify that he walks the talk. And the coconut porter is out of this world, Brian says. So that's excellent to hear. I'm jealous. I'd love to go and savor the flavors of Maui at the Maui Brewing Company. Bob from Madison, Mississippi writes, I live in Mississippi and several of us are interested in growing our own hops. I noticed on one of your videos that you've grown hops in Fayetteville. What varieties did you grow? The weather in Mississippi and Arkansas are very similar, hot and humid. I would think if you had some luck, maybe we would too. Well, that's a timely question, especially with the way the hop situation is right now. Homebrewers may want to look at growing their own hops, and I'm planning an episode in the near future on the hop situation. I planted a Cascade rhizome last year, and it did great. In its first year, it grew very long and strong vines, and we picked almost 2 pounds of wet hops from it. And the same thing this year from that same Cascade rhizome. Very hardy growth and lots of hop cones. And this despite my pretty much neglecting it through the hot summer. So, by the way, those hops made a very tasty harvest ale. So this year, I planted 2 more rhizomes, a Hallertau and a Kent Goldings, and they didn't fare so well. They sent up a few weak vines, and I think there were only like half a dozen hop cones between them. So next year I'm vowing to water them and pay more attention to them to see if that makes a difference, and I hope it does. Otherwise, if my experience is any indication, Cascade seems to like living in the South. So let me know how you fare with your hops, Bob. Brian from Nashua, New Hampshire writes, I've been using pellet hops, and I used to put them in hop bags. Though for my past few batches, I've been leaving my pellets loose in the boiling pot, and I think I'm getting better tasting beer. My questions are, first, does this make sense? Would leaving hop pellets to float around in the boil versus bagging them help the taste? Next, I usually pour about 2 gallons of wort into the carboy through a funnel that has a really fine strainer. This clogs the strainer much easier this way, so I have to stir the wort as it's entering the carboy. It also causes me to have to pour the wort in several pours. My question is, should I worry about straining the hops out? If I just leave them in the primary, will I affect the end result of the beer? Well, Brian, this is a question that'll get different answers depending on who you ask, but you asked me, so here's my take on it. I've never used a hop bag in the kettle. My theory is if the hops are flying around in a vigorous boil, I'm going to get better utilization, and that just works with my system. You know, other brewers use hop bags, love them, and make great beer. So, like I say, it depends on who you ask. As far as hops in the fermenter, I've used strainers, like spaghetti strainers, to pour the beer through to catch most of the hops, but I don't think hops in the fermenter, I don't think that's going to hurt you if you miss some or if you get some hops in the fermenter, at least in my experience. However, here's a method that I use to keep the trub and the hops, out of the fermenter. And I think I've talked about this on the show before, but it's been a while. After I cool my wort with an immersion chiller, I do a very fast whirlpool with a sanitized spoon. I get it going really well, and I let that settle for about 15 minutes. And this usually creates a nice cone of trub in the bottom of the kettle. And then it's easy to use like an auto siphon or a racking cane to rack the wort away from the trub into the fermenter. It works great, and it's easy. So I hope that helps. That's just my way of thinking on that issue. If you have any questions, suggestions, or feedback on what I've said, please let me know. I certainly don't have a monopoly on the truth, and I appreciate hearing new ways of brewing from you guys. Well, you can send your email to james@basicbrewing.com, or just use the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from, and please check your email address so that I can get back to you. I've had a couple of emails kicked back because people's inboxes are full. So, clean your inbox, said the pot to the kettle. Now, one of the suggestions that I've received over time through email is a request from a few of you to do a show on sake. To be honest with you, I've been hesitant because I don't know the first thing about it. However, I got a note recently from Bob Taylor in Anchorage with a link to his site describing the process that he uses. And Bob's intention was to try to get Steve and me to make sake on Basic Brewing video. But instead, I roped him into coming on this podcast to share his method with you guys. Well, Bob Taylor, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thank you.
And you're a rare bird here on the show. You're not a listener, but you've watched the video podcast, so this should be interesting.
Yeah, it might be. I'll definitely be listening to this podcast.
You contacted me because you had wondered, you were suggesting that we make sake on the video podcast, and you forwarded me a link to your guide on making sake. And I was so impressed with it that I said, well, I've had requests in the past on the audio podcast to do a sake episode, but I know nothing about it. And so I was looking for an expert to do that, and you just kind of volunteered yourself. So congratulations, Bob.
Imagine that. It wasn't my intent to volunteer myself, but I was kind of curious to see you guys do a sake show.
Well, it's quite an involved process, at least the way you do it. And you say in your blog, and I'll link to your blog on our website, but you say that your way is not the only way, but you think it's the best way. How does it differ from other ways of making sake?
Well, if you get on the web and you Google up a guide for making sake, they all basically equate to the Japanese style of homebrew, which is take your koji and your rice and your yeast and water, put them all in a bucket and let it ferment out at room temperature. The result is, well, I guess you could call it sake, but it's not going to taste anything like sake, at least not the commercial stuff that you can buy. And the reason for that is first of all, anybody who's been making beer for a while knows that if you're fermenting at room temperature, anything above 70 degrees or so, you're going to sometimes get some off flavors. The sake yeast in particular can produce some pretty funky off flavors. But more important is you're going to get some lactobacillus in there that's going to acidify it for you. And if you ferment at room temperature, the lactobacillus can take over and you end up with something that's very sour. Some people like sour. I don't.
Well, I like appropriately soured things, but so I don't have even much background in drinking sake. So tell me about sake. What is it? It is commonly referred to as a rice wine, but is that correct?
Well, it's about as correct as we have a category for it here in North America. It's got the strength of a wine. But wine is, of course, made from fruit, most commonly the grape. But in the case of sake, you're actually making it from a grain, which is rice. And but it's not hopped, it's not carbonated, it's very high in alcohol, so it's definitely not a beer. So it's somewhere in between. I prefer to refer to it as zhou, which is the Chinese word for anything alcoholic made from rice.
So that's pretty simple. It's just its own thing. It's kind of like mead. Mead is not a wine because it's not made with grapes, and it's not a beer because it's not made with barley. So it's another thing unto itself.
Exactly.
So get us started. I mean, what first of all, I would assume that homebrewers would be familiar with most of the equipment that you would need in making sake.
And home winemakers as well. It's very basic equipment. You just need some kind of a primary fermenter, an open one you can get your hands down into, which is to say a plastic bucket. Just about every home brewer on the planet's got one of those, right? You're also going to need a rack and cane, a stainless steel spoon, a big one that you can stir with, and probably the only specialized piece of equipment you need is a steamer that can hold up to 3 pounds of rice.
I looked on Amazon, by the way, and they do have steamers on Amazon, so they are readily available.
Yeah, they're readily available, and they're not too expensive. About $30 will get you in there with an aluminum one. And, I mean, that's all you need. And it's not like it's a piece of equipment you're only going to use for making sake. They're great for steaming veggies and stuff for your dinner as well.
So what kinds of ingredients goes into the sake?
Well, just like your beer, you're going to have 4 ingredients. Water, of course, is the biggest one. Then you're going to have rice, an ingredient called koji, or kome koji, which is it's rice that's been inoculated with a mold that's going to secrete the enzymes that will saccharify your rice for you. Since you can't malt rice, you need that in order to actually create the sugars from the rice starch. And, of course, you're going to need yeast.
Now, we can find water, and we can find, do White Labs and Y Yeast both have sake yeasts?
Only White Yeast has had it so far. I've never seen White Labs release it. You can get by with just a white wine yeast if you can't find sake yeast. But my local homebrew supplier stocks the sake yeast, and if I can get it here in Alaska, probably your local homebrew store has it as well.
Well, and what type of rice are we talking about?
Rice is rice. You can use anything you can get your hands on. But, sake is traditionally made using a short grain rice. And the reason for that is there's more starch compared to protein and fats and anything else in that rice, as well as the structure of the grain itself. It's a starch hull around a hollow, filled with loose starch particles. So it's just easier for the koji to get hold of it and turn it into sugar. But I've heard of people making, sake using long grain rices like jasmine rice. And there's nothing wrong with that. Any kind of rice you want to get your hands on and make sake with will work.
I'm assuming that minute rice won't work, though, right?
Yeah, parboiled rice, there's no reason why it wouldn't work, but generally it's had additives put into it that you just don't want in your sake.
And where would you get your koji?
Koji is probably going to be the hardest ingredient to find, mainly because people won't know where to look for it. Any kind of grocery store that is going to cater to ethnic tastes, particularly Japanese, is going to stock koji. Really, it's up to you to find where you can get it locally. You can order the koji spores online if you can't find dried koji locally. And with those spores, you can just make your own.
What's our first step? How do we get started?
Well, just like making a beer, and I'm going to draw a lot of beer making parallels here because we are all brewers. Just like making a beer, you need to make a yeast starter to get your yeast population up to the point where they can tackle the main task of the fermentation. The Japanese call that the moto, or the seed mash. And the steps for that, it looks very complicated on paper, but it's very simple in practice. The night before, you're going to put some koji, the dried koji, in some water and let that soak in the refrigerator. At the same time, you're going to put some rice in a few inches of water and let that soak. And the next day, you take your rice out, give it a drain, and you steam it to cook it, and then you add it to that water with the koji. Soaking that koji gets all of those enzymes out into the water where the water can be absorbed by the rice you just cooked. And you let that sit for a couple of days at room temperature, and you'll watch the rice soak up all that water, and then it'll turn back into a liquid. It's really amazing to see it happen. And after that, you add your yeast to it. And after about 3 days of that, your yeast is going to ferment all the way through that. Then it's going to kind of settle down, and lactic acid bacteria will take over and start producing some acid. That's when you want to refrigerate it for about 5 days. Total, that moto step is going to take about 2 weeks.
This is still the starter stage at this point?
This is just the yeast starter. It sounds really complicated and long, but the reason you want to do that is you want that lactobacillus to take over at the end of that ferment and produce the acid that's going to acidify your main ferment down to the point where yeast likes to work.
And so at the end of that time period, you've got a healthy yeast starter, and you said refrigerate it.
Yeah, you want to take it down to about 50 degrees.
And 50 degrees seems to be a magic number for a lot of this process.
Right. And that's why the Japanese call it the kanzukuri process, and which means cold fermented. And the reason for that is because at those temperatures, the sake yeast will take over and plow through the ferment, while any other bugs that are in there, like lactobacillus, which is a pretty important one for the process, but you don't want it to take over and produce too much acid. Those bugs go to sleep at that temperature. So
you want a little bit of the sourness, but not a tremendous amount. And I would assume that fermenting the sake yeast at a higher temperature would give you different results than fermenting it at the proper temperature as well.
Right.
So we've got our starter, and we've got it refrigerated. Now, do we go on to making our main, so to speak, mash? Or
it's kind of hard to describe it in familiar brewing terms. I just refer to it the same way the Japanese do. They call it the moromi, which is the main ferment. And with making sake, you're conducting a mash and a fermentation at the same time. Unlike beer, where you're taking your grain and your water and letting the enzymes convert it all to sugar, then you hop it, boil it, etc., and then the yeast take over. That doesn't happen with sake.
So you're essentially letting the enzymes work on the rice and letting the yeast work on the rice simultaneously.
If you take a fermenting wine and you keep adding sugar to it as it ferments, what happens is you kind of push those yeasts beyond their normal limits. So where your normal wine yeast would kind of stop at 15, 16%, or 12%, or however much they like to tolerate, if you keep adding sugar, you kind of keep pushing them beyond where they go, and you'll end up with a wine that's more like 18 or 20%. That's exactly what you're doing when you're making sake. Is you're adding koji and rice, and the koji can convert that rice to sugar a little at a time, and as it gets converted to sugar, it almost immediately gets fermented into alcohol by the yeast.
So how much rice do we give us some ideas of the quantities of rice that we're adding at these different stages? And I would assume that the rice would be steamed for this first fermenting stage as well.
Right. Well, when you start into the moromi, for a standard recipe, which, like I provide, is going to produce about 3 gallons of finished sake, you're going to use a total 10 pounds of rice. But for that first, moto stage where you're making your yeast starter, you're only using 1.5 cups of rice. All measurements in this are volumetric. That's how the Japanese did it for hundreds of years, and it works well that way. You don't have to weigh anything out. Rice doesn't pack down like flour, so it works just fine doing it volumetric. Every time you add rice to your fermentation for the moromi ferment, you're doubling your total volume.
Okay, so we're starting off when we'd go from the starter then, and let me take a guess. We start with 3 cups of rice then with the first ferment?
Close. You're going to do 2.5 cups.
Ah. Not bad for a stab in the dark.
Yeah, you're not just doubling the rice, you're doubling the total volume in your fermenter, so you have to account for the water and the koji as well. You're using 2.5 cups of rice, and you're going to use 1/2 cup of koji. The koji gets added to the moto the night before. You're going to start this step, and the reason is just to get some fresh enzymes in there. At the same time, you're going to put down some rice to soak. And that's how you do it with every step. Every time you add rice, it gets soaked the night before. And anybody who's steamed rice understands that that's so that the rice can soak up the water that's actually going to cook it. So if you're going to be, when you're starting the moromi, or the first edition, which the Japanese call hatsuzoe, what you're doing is the night before you start the step, you put down your rice to soak, and you add koji to your yeast starter. And then the next day you steam your rice. You're going to add it to 2 3/4 cups of water, cold water that you chilled down before, you started steaming. And that's the idea with the cold water, is to drop the rice temperature down to a manageable temperature before you add it to your yeast starter. And that's it. After that, you add it into the yeast starter and use your clean hands to break up all the rice lumps, and you give it a good mix for 20 to 30 minutes.
Now that's where it would seems like that you would need a lot of patience, because 20 to 30 minutes with your hands and some rice, it seems like that would be one place where I might be tempted to take a shortcut.
The reason that you're wanting to mix it for so long is to introduce oxygen into the yeast starter. And all brewers are familiar with the need for oxygen for yeast to reproduce. This is our equivalent to where at the end of your boil you would chill your wort and then aerate it before adding your yeast. In this case, you're aerating it with your hands after you add the rice in there.
So would there be a shortcut if you had an oxygen tank to give it just a few bursts of oxygen instead, and maybe take a shortcut on maybe not mixing the rice in there as long?
You could probably shortcut it that way, but really in practice the way I do it is I mix it until I can feel that there aren't any more rice clumps in there. As long as you break up all the clumps, you can assume that you've added enough oxygen in there in the form of aerating it.
And if this process has been done for centuries this way, there's probably a good reason for doing it.
Yeah, all the old Japanese toji, their brewmasters all swear by getting in there with your hands and mixing it. Most brewers would kind of wince at that.
Yeah.
But as long as you've washed your hands really well, there's really no problem with it, and I've never had bad results from it.
Now, at this point, you're needing some sort of a refrigeration device, right? Because you're or at least a place that's a constant around 50 degree Fahrenheit temperature.
At this point, you're not going to refrigerate it just yet. You're still in the first step of the Moromi ferment, your Hatsuzoe.
Oh, okay.
You need to keep it at around 70 degrees for about the next 3 or 4 days, because you're still going to be adding more rice to it, and you want your yeast to be active enough and reproducing to handle the rice and koji that you're adding into it. After that first addition, you're just going to leave it at room temperature for a couple of days, and you're going to give it a stir with your big sanitized stainless steel spoon twice a day.
And does it start looking like a traditional or a regular beer fermentation at that point?
You'll definitely see a krausen pop up. You'll see a krausen pop up within minutes of adding that rice after you're done stirring it in.
And is it as active? I mean, do you use? I assume you use an airlock, and
if you have it at room temperature when your bucket lid seals really well, and they're notorious for not sealing very well, an airlock on there will be definitely bubbling.
So that's something familiar.
Yeah, that's very familiar. And you'll have a krausen on top of that fermenting sake. 2 days later, you're going to add more rice. And where you had 2 3/4 rice before, now you're going to use 6 cups.
And prepared in the same way that the previous batch was.
Exactly. You're going to wash it, soak it, and steam it. And just as before, you're going to add 1.5 cups of koji to the fermenter the night before, and stir it in with your big old stainless sanitized spoon. I've got it marked out on the website, what day you're going to be doing these steps on, to make it clear, because it gets kind of confusing, all these steps that have to be done in advance and at certain times. Yeah,
this is probably like all grain brewing was for me. To really understand the process, I'm probably going to have to actually do it, and read the instructions and actually just kind of walk through the process.
It helps if you have a to-do list printed out as well, that you can check off steps as you do them, so that you know what time and what day they have to be performed. It looks really intensive, but it's once you get the fermentation going, you just leave it alone for 3 weeks. We're on the second edition, which is Nakazoe, and once you get that rice added in there with the 8 3/4 cups of cold water that it requires, you mix it up for 30 minutes, again with your hands, just enough to break up all the lumps. Put the lid back on, keep it at room temperature, and give it another stir after 12 hours. At the same time, you're going to add the next addition of koji, which is the rest of the koji left in your tub. At that same time, you're going to be putting the rest of your rice down the soak, which is the remaining rice in your 10-pound bag of rice. That's 5 pounds of rice. And you're going to need a steamer either big enough to accommodate that, or you're just going to need to steam it in batches.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay to do it in batches. You just, add the, half of it at a time or a third at a time, however much your steamer can handle. And you're going to be adding that to a gallon plus 1 cup of cold water. And then adding it into your moromi ferment. Once you add the rice in there, you leave it overnight, just overnight at room temperature to let the fermentation really get rolling. And then you want to bring it down to 50 degrees or as close to 50 degrees as you can get it.
Does it matter if you do that gradually, or do you need to do it gradually?
I've never had a problem with shocking the yeast out of activity just by putting it in my chest freezer set at 50 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, that fermentation is really going, and it's producing its own heat anyway.
Yeah, but they say with the lager fermentation, that it's the safest way to do it is to step it down over a period of days. But it sounds like there's enough going on here with this that and maybe the yeast has been bred, so to speak, to tolerate that.
That's possible. Like I said, I've never had a problem with the fermentation just stopping because I chilled it down 20 degrees overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going to, because of the heat that the fermentation is producing, it's not going to chill down that fast.
Mm-hmm.
But you want to keep it at about 50 degrees for the next 3 weeks. After 2 weeks is when I usually start checking the specific gravity, which should be down pretty close to 1.0.
So it's a very high alcohol drink.
This process, if you were to compare it to the process outlined on other websites that add citric acid to acidify it and things like that, and it adds all your rice and koji and water all at the same time, that might turn out 14 or 15% alcohol, maybe. It didn't taste very alcoholic when I did it that way the first time I ever made sake. This method will turn out a sake that's somewhere between 18 and 21% alcohol.
Is that more authentic?
If you look at the commercial alcohols available or commercial sakes available here in the U.S., they're all standardized at 16%. I'm not sure why that is. I'm really thinking that's for tax reasons. In Japan, you can get the sakes that are full strength like that, and they're somewhere between 18 and 21%. Usually 20% is what you're going to see.
Now, what are the main pitfalls? Through your experience in making sakes, what are the tips that you can give us after reading your guide that we're going to especially want to look out for?
My biggest pitfall that I've ever experienced is trying to shortcut it. The first time I ever made sake, I made it using that Japanese homebrew method of adding everything all at once, cooking the rice in a rice cooker or in a pan on the stove like for dinner rice, and the result wasn't drinkable. The two real big pitfalls there is not steaming your rice and trying to shortcut the process in any way.
So you talk in your site as well about different ways, different styles of sake and different ways to serve it. For those of us like me who are sake ignorant, take us on a little trip through some things that you can do with your sake once you've got it.
Well, once you've made the homebrew sake with the method that I've shown you on the site there, where you're going to end up finding the bentonite to make it very clear, and decanting it off of the lees and all the other sediment that you're going to find, you're going to end up with what the Japanese call seishu, which is the authentic refined sake. And most people who have drunk sake know that hot sake is really good, but hot sake is a very bad thing because it really alters the flavor of the sake itself. You don't want it too hot. You want it to be, I like it about 120 degrees.
And if you get it too hot, and if you mentioned that in some restaurants they keep it hot for a long period of time, you start boiling off the alcohol because alcohol boils at a lower temperature than...
alcohol boils at 170 degrees. Mm-hmm. So if you heat your sake up to the point where it's like tea, it's really too hot to drink, and you're going to, boil off that alcohol as well as a lot of the other flavor components that are in that sake. So if you're going to drink it warm, which is great, during the wintertime here, that's all I drink is warm sake. Bring it up to 120 degrees in a water bath. This sake that we've just made is also great chilled. Stick it in the refrigerator and then, pour it into your masu cup to drink it.
Are there flavorings like meads? Can you add some flavorings to it to get some kind of variety?
In the last step of the fermentation, the yodan, you can add water to bring the alcohol content down, and then add fruit concentrate. Like the frozen concentrates that you buy at the store.
Mm-hmm.
You can add that in there to create a sweet fruit sake. This is the most traditional form of this is we know as plum wine.
So out of that 3 gallons of sake, you can experiment and have a lot of fun.
Yeah, I have instructions on there for water additions for several different levels of alcohol content. If you don't add any water at all, what you have is a full-strength stuff, which is called genshu.
Is that Japanese for a wild Saturday night, or?
Genshu just means full strength. Yeah, it could be a wild Saturday night. Public drunkenness is definitely not frowned upon over there.
They seem so restrained.
If you've never been to Japan, it could seem that way. But I used to live there when I was a kid, so.
And we've all seen the stereotypical karaoke bar scenes in movies and such with the Japanese businessmen.
Yeah, well, they really do look like that. Well, I kind of wanted to go back to the different ways of drinking sake.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I had mentioned, your chilled sake, but also a really great way to drink it in the summertime is to take your bottle of genshu and you put it in a freezer until it gets all mushy with ice crystals. There's another style of sake that you can make with this method just by not finding it. And, you'll end up with almost an inch of fluffy white sediment in the bottom of the bottle. And just like a Hefeweizen, you stir that up so that you end up with a clare sake. This is called nigori sake. And the flavor, you never ever drink it warm. The flavor is a much smoother, creamier, just a lot different from your regular, clear sake.
Well, it's intriguing. You've piqued my interest, I've got to say, Bob.
As far as pushing people into making their own sake, if you like sake, make your own.
I may have to find some good commercial examples out there before I venture into making it myself, so that I can know if I've made it correctly. Are there some brands that you can recommend that are actually good sake brands?
Well, Sho Chikubai makes a really good ginjo sake. Ginjo is being their word for premium. And it's about, 16%, like it's all standardized over here. And I pay about $30 a bottle for that. Another really good sake that I can't find up here, but I've had it in the lower 48 is Takara or Takara. And that's, made in Hawaii.
I can't promise that we'll do a sake episode very soon on Basic Brewing Video, but if you do see us do sake, you can take credit.
Well, I'll tell you right now, it's going to be a video that you're going to work on for at least a couple of months to get all the footage you need for making it. Because once you've fermented that sake for 3 weeks and you rack it off of the leaves and you press the leaves to get everything out and top it up, then you need to let it sit for a couple of weeks to finish fermenting out. And it's just sake isn't like a beer where you can have it done in 6 weeks. It takes 2 to 3 months.
Well, Bob, this has been fun, and like I said, I will put a link on our website on basicbrewingradio.com in the description of this episode. I'll put a link to your website, and hopefully we'll get to send some people your way, and maybe we will encourage more people to get into the world of sake. Absolutely.
If you make your own beer or you make your own wine or mead, I give sake a try. It's what I do up here in the wintertime because I can't really get outside to do a boil. It's a good wintertime project for people who have to brew outside.
Well, excellent. I appreciate your time, Bob. It was fun talking to you.
Oh, it's fun talking to you.
Well, thanks again to Bob for taking time out from looking after his daughter, by the way, to talk with us. I'll post a link to Bob's site in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say howdy, write to james@basicbrewing.com, or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com, and please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And don't forget, we need your homebrew horror stories, those days when brewing goes wrong, and what you've learned from it. Our 2008 Brewers Logbooks are here. Check them out on our site. You can see scans of the actual pages, and I think you'll like them. People seem to like them. They're buying them again this year. And check out our new low-tech lagering and decoction mashing DVD, where you can see Steve do a single-step decoction mash, and follow me through a lager fermentation in the middle of a summer here in northwest Arkansas, where I don't use a dedicated chest freezer. Oh. There are also our original DVDs. In a Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. And we've got new combo deals to save you a few bucks if you want to buy more than one DVD at a time. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com, and if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online from us. And we've still got the hats and shirts. And thanks to everybody who's continued to click on our Amazon.com link. We appreciate the support there. Our featured products this week that were purchased through the link are Fred Hot Hands Insulating Mitt, dog, and Conair HLM10R Hot Lather Machine. Now that is a classic Christmas gift. That and soap on a rope. That takes me back. Thanks again, everybody. And remember, I can't tell you who bought what, so no worries there. You know, I got my dad one of those hot lather machines back when. Seemed to like it. Just click on the Amazon.com logo on our site the next time you feel like Amazon shopping. We appreciate your support. That's all until next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everybody. I'm James Spencer, production help for Basic Brewing Radio. And our website is provided by our buddy in Austin, Kelly Dodson, who also did our logo. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time, everybody. So long.